Hello and welcome back to the Cosmic Enigma. Here we share real-life experiences of encounters with the unknown, stories that come from beyond the stars, crafted to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I love seeing just how far this mystery reaches. Now find a comfortable spot, take a deep breath, and let yourself be carried away. Story 1. The entrance was accessible without obstruction. The hallway exhibited no immediate signs of disruption. The carpet was unmarked, the air undisturbed. A single duffel bag rested near the exit, unzipped, contents concealed. A telephone receiver lay beside it, disconnected, yet the cord remained intact. No audible alarms signaled disturbance, though a faint ringing persisted from an unidentified source. All windows were latched securely. The surrounding environment was orderly. And yet footsteps echoed in the absence of movement. That was 3 months ago. I'm telling you this because I need someone to understand what's still happening to me. Every night I hear them again, those same footsteps. They start around the time the streetlights flicker, when the electrical hum in the walls grows just a little too loud. The sound comes from above, methodical and patient, like someone pacing in measured intervals, but I live on the top floor. The maintenance crew checked the roof twice. They found nothing. No damage, no loose materials, no animals. Just that persistent sound of weight shifting across surfaces that shouldn't bear weight. When I press my ear to the ceiling, I can feel vibrations traveling through the plaster, rhythmic and deliberate. Sometimes the vibrations stop for hours and I think maybe it's over. Then they return, always at the same steady pace. My electronics have developed peculiarities. The television turns itself on, always tuned to static channels that shouldn't exist anymore. The screen fills with interference patterns that seem almost intentional, geometric shapes that pulse in sync with those footsteps overhead. The refrigerator hums in frequencies that make my teeth ache. When I unplug it, the humming continues for minutes longer than it should. Sleep has become impossible, not because of fear exactly, but because of awareness. There's a sensation of being observed, measured, catalogued. When I close my eyes, I see that same pale light seeping through my eyelids, the one that doesn't correspond to any source in the room. It moves across the walls like a slow searchlight, casting shadows that bend in directions that defy the light's apparent origin. The dreams, when they come, aren't really dreams. They're fragments of memory trying to reassemble themselves. I see myself standing in that hallway again, staring at the duffel bag, listening to the phantom ringing. But in these visions, I'm viewing the scene from above, as if I'm floating near the ceiling, watching my own confusion unfold below. I can see the back of my head, the way my shoulders tensed as I tried to locate the source of that persistent tone. That tone, its return now faint but constant, like tinnitus that comes and goes according to some external schedule. Medical examinations reveal nothing wrong with my hearing. The sound exists, but only I can perceive it. It's clearest in the early hours when the city grows quiet and other frequencies fade away. A high, thin note that seems to emanate from the walls themselves. I've started documenting the patterns. The footsteps occur in sequences of 17 steps, followed by a pause, then 17 more. The television static forms the same geometric configurations each time. The pale light follows the same path across my ceiling, moving from east to west over the course of exactly 4 minutes. These aren't random disturbances. They're repetitions, like a recording playing back the same sequence endlessly. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about that night, the one that changed everything. The memory comes back in pieces, never in the right order, never complete. I remember standing at the window of my room, looking out at the courtyard below. The air outside had taken on that peculiar quality it gets before storms, thick and charged, making everything feel closer than it should. But there was no storm that night. The sky was clear, filled with more stars than seemed possible for the city. They pulsed gently, like distant signals. That's when I first noticed the silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of wrongness. The usual nighttime chorus of air conditioners, distant traffic, and settling buildings had stopped. Even the electrical hum that normally permeates everything had ceased. In that unnatural quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat, my own breathing, amplified and strange. The temperature in the room began to shift, not dropping or rising, but fluctuating in waves as if the air itself was breathing. I could feel the changes against my skin, warm and cool currents that moved independently of any ventilation system. The walls seemed to pulse gently, expanding and contracting by fractions of inches, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. I pressed my palm against the wall beside the window. The surface felt different, not quite solid, not quite yielding, but something in between, like touching the skin of something vast and sleeping. When I pulled my hand away, the warmth of my palm remained visible on the wall for several seconds, a glowing handprint that faded slowly back to normal. That's when I saw the figure. It stood in the courtyard perfectly still, positioned directly beneath the single lamp that illuminated the central pathway. At first glance, it appeared to be a person waiting for someone, perhaps a resident returning home late. But as I watched, certain details became apparent that didn't align with normal human behavior. The figure cast no shadow despite standing directly under the light. Its posture was too rigid, too perfectly vertical, like a sculpture rather than a living being, and it never moved. Not even the small, unconscious movements that people make when standing still. No shifting weight, no adjusting posture, no turning of the head, just absolute, unnatural stillness. I watched it for what felt like an hour. During that time, several residents passed through the courtyard, walking their dogs or returning from late shifts. None of them seemed to notice the figure. They walked past it, sometimes within arm's reach, without acknowledgement or reaction, as if it wasn't there at all. But it was there. I could see it clearly, illuminated by the lamp, solid and present. Tall, wearing what appeared to be dark clothing, though the details were difficult to make out from my window. What I could see clearly was its face, or where its face should have been. Instead of features, there was a smooth, reflective surface that caught the lamplight and held it without scattering. The longer I watched, the more certain I became that it was watching me in return. Despite the lack of visible eyes, I could feel its attention like a physical pressure against my skin. The air in my room grew thicker, charged with the same electrical tension I'd noticed earlier. My vision began to blur slightly around the edges, as if I were looking through water. Then the lights went out. Not just the lamp in the courtyard, but every light in the surrounding buildings. The sudden darkness was complete and absolute, more profound than any natural blackout I'd experienced. Even the emergency lighting failed to activate. The silence that followed was equally complete, as if the entire world had been muted. In that darkness, something began to glow. The figure in the courtyard had become luminescent, emitting a pale, cold light that seemed to absorb rather than illuminate. The glow outlined its form without revealing details, creating a silhouette of brightness against the black surroundings. As I watched, the light began to pulse, slowly and rhythmically, like a heartbeat made visible. The pulsing synchronized with something I could feel in my chest, a resonance that seemed to tune my own heartbeat to match its rhythm. My breathing slowed to accommodate the new pace. The sensation wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was profoundly wrong, as if my body was being adjusted by an external force. The figure began to move, not walking, but gliding across the courtyard with the same perfect stillness it had maintained while stationary. Its feet never touched the ground, hovering perhaps an inch above the pavement. The pale light it emitted cast no shadows on the surrounding surfaces, creating an impossible scene where the source of illumination seemed to exist independently of the laws of physics. As it moved closer to my building, I noticed other details that defied explanation. The air around it seemed to ripple like heat waves rising from summer pavement, but the night was cool. Where its light touched the walls and windows of the building, the surfaces became reflective, turning into mirrors that showed not the courtyard, but somewhere else entirely. Vast, empty spaces filled with the same pale glow. I tried to step back from the window, but found that my muscles wouldn't respond to my intentions. Not paralyzed exactly, but disconnected, as if the signals from my brain were being intercepted and filtered before reaching my body. I could still move, but only in ways that kept me positioned at the window, watching. The figure stopped directly below my window and turned its reflective face upward. In that smooth surface, I could see myself looking down, but the reflection was wrong. The person in the reflection moved independently, turning its head to look at things I couldn't see, reacting to sounds I couldn't hear. It was as if I were watching another version of myself, one that existed in a space adjacent to my own. That's when the humming started. It began as a vibration in the building's structure, felt rather than heard. The frequency was so low it seemed to originate from the earth itself, rising through the foundation and into the walls. Gradually it climbed into audible range, becoming a tone that seemed to resonate in my bones. Not unpleasant, but utterly alien, unlike any sound produced by human technology or natural phenomena. The tone grew stronger, more complex, developing harmonics that created an almost musical quality. But it was music designed for minds unlike ours, following patterns that human perception couldn't quite grasp. I found myself trying to hum along, my throat producing sounds I'd never made before, frequencies that felt foreign in my mouth. As the humming reached its peak intensity, the pale light from the figure below began to expand, growing brighter and more encompassing. It rose from the courtyard like luminous fog, seeping through the spaces around my window, entering my room despite the closed glass. Where it touched me, my skin tingled with a sensation like mild electrical current, not painful but deeply strange. The light brought with it a smell, ozone like the air after lightning strikes, mixed with something metallic and sharp. But underneath those recognizable scents was something else, something that didn't correspond to any earthly reference. It was the smell of vast distances, of spaces between stars, of emptiness that had never known atmosphere or life. My vision began to change. The familiar dimensions of my room seemed to stretch and fold, creating impossible geometries that my eyes could perceive but my mind couldn't process. The walls curved away into distances that shouldn't exist within the building's structure. The ceiling rose to heights that exceeded the building's total elevation. I was still in my room, but my room had become something larger, something that existed partially outside normal space. In this expanded environment, I could see them more clearly. Not just the figure in the courtyard, but others, positioned throughout the altered landscape of my surroundings. They stood at regular intervals, each emitting the same pale glow, each maintaining the same perfect stillness. They formed a pattern, a geometric arrangement that extended beyond my ability to perceive its full scope. The humming reached a crescendo, and then, suddenly, everything stopped. The lights returned, the normal sounds of the city resumed. My room contracted back to its familiar dimensions. When I looked out the window, the courtyard was empty, illuminated by the same lamp as always. The figure was gone, along with any evidence that it had ever been there. But something had changed in me. I could feel it immediately, a subtle alteration in my perception, as if a new sense had been activated or an old one recalibrated. The world looked the same, but felt different. Colors seemed slightly shifted, sounds carried additional frequencies, and the air itself felt more substantial, more aware. I tried to convince myself it had been a dream, a hallucination brought on by stress or fatigue. But the changes in my environment were real and persistent. The electronic disturbances, the phantom footsteps, the sense of being observed, these weren't symptoms of psychological distress. They were evidence of ongoing contact, proof that whatever had happened that night was continuing to happen. Going back further, I can remember the signs I should have recognized. The week before that night, small anomalies had begun appearing in my daily routine. Electronics would malfunction briefly, just long enough to notice. Lights would flicker in sequences that seemed too regular to be random. The temperature in certain rooms would fluctuate without apparent cause. I'd attributed these incidents to aging infrastructure, electrical problems, or simple coincidence. But looking back, they formed a clear pattern of escalating activity. Something had been preparing, testing, calibrating its interaction with our environment. The disturbances weren't random, they were experiments. The metallic smell had appeared first, several days before the main event. I'd noticed it in the hallway outside my door, faint but persistent, like the scent of copper pennies mixed with ozone. It would come and go without warning, sometimes lasting for hours, sometimes disappearing within minutes. I checked for gas leaks, examined the electrical panels, even called maintenance to inspect the ventilation system. They found nothing wrong. But the smell continued, growing stronger each day, accompanied by an increasingly noticeable vibration in the building's structure. The vibration was subtle, felt rather than heard, like standing near heavy machinery operating at a distance. It seemed to pulse in regular intervals, creating a rhythm that I began to anticipate unconsciously. During this period, my sleep patterns started to change. Not insomnia exactly, but a shift in the quality of rest. I would fall asleep normally, but wake feeling as if I'd been active during the night, engaged in activities I couldn't remember. Sometimes I'd find myself in different positions than where I'd fallen asleep, or discover that hours had passed without any subjective experience of time. My dreams during this period were unusually vivid and consistent. I would find myself standing in vast, empty spaces filled with pale light, surrounded by figures that maintained perfect stillness. We would communicate without words, exchanging information through methods that felt natural in the dream, but impossible to explain upon waking. These weren't typical dreams, but felt more like memories of experiences I'd never had. The most disturbing aspect was the growing certainty that these dreams were shared experiences, that the figures I encountered were not products of my imagination, but actual entities communicating across impossible distances. Upon waking, I would retain fragments of information that seemed to originate from outside my own knowledge, details about places I'd never been and concepts I'd never studied. Even earlier, perhaps a month before the main event, I'd begun experiencing episodes of temporal displacement. I would begin a task and suddenly find it completed, with no memory of the intervening time. Conversations would resume in the middle, as if I'd been participating in dialogue I couldn't remember starting. These gaps were brief, usually lasting only minutes, but they occurred with increasing frequency. During one such episode, I discovered notes written in my own handwriting that I had no memory of creating. The content was technical, filled with diagrams and calculations that exceeded my educational background. The The drawings depicted geometric forms and mathematical relationships that seemed familiar despite being completely foreign to my conscious knowledge. The notes were written in a mixture of languages, some recognizable, others completely unknown. Yet when I read them, the meaning was clear, as if my mind contained a translation mechanism I wasn't aware of possessing. The information dealt with concepts of space, time, and consciousness that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. Most disturbing was the realization that the handwriting, while clearly mine, showed subtle variations that suggested different states of consciousness during composition. Some sections were written in my normal script, while others showed modifications in letter formation and spacing that indicated altered mental states. It was as if multiple versions of myself had contributed to the document. The final entry in these notes was a simple statement: "They are preparing for contact. The process has already begun." Below this was a date, marking the night when everything would change. But before any of this began, before the first signs of contact manifested, there was a period of perfect normalcy. I remember it clearly now, that last week of ordinary existence, when the world operated according to familiar rules and the future seemed predictable. The weather had been unusually clear, with night skies so transparent that stars were visible despite the city's light pollution. I'd taken to spending evenings on my balcony, enjoying the rare clarity and the sense of connection to the cosmos that such nights provide. The air was clean and still, filled with the normal sounds of urban life winding down for the night. My routine was comfortable and established. Work, meals, sleep, all following patterns that had developed over years of consistent living. The apartment felt secure and familiar, a refuge from the complexities of daily life. Electronics functioned normally, temperatures remained stable, and the only sounds were those expected in a residential building. I felt healthy and mentally balanced, free from the stress and anxiety that would soon become constant companions. Sleep came easily and provided genuine rest. Dreams, when they occurred, were ordinary reflections of daily experience, not the profound and disturbing visions that would later dominate my nights. The world seemed solid and predictable, governed by natural laws that provided comfort through their consistency. The future appeared manageable, filled with ordinary challenges and familiar pleasures. There was no indication that everything was about to change, no warning that contact was imminent. Yet even in that period of normalcy, something was different. A subtle alteration in the quality of light, perhaps, or a barely perceptible shift in the way sound traveled through the air. Changes so minimal that they registered only at the edge of consciousness, creating a vague sense that something was approaching, something vast and patient and utterly other. They had been watching for much longer than I realized, studying, learning, preparing for the moment when contact would become inevitable. And now, 3 months later, I understand that the process is far from over. The footsteps continue overhead, the electronics maintain their strange behavior, and the pale light still visits my room in the early hours. They are still here, still watching, still waiting, and I know with absolute certainty that they will return, story 2. The button failed to glow with my touch. My fingers traced the familiar outline, expecting the click beneath my skin, but it remained silent. The mirrored walls reflected a distorted sense of movement, yet offered no reassurance. There was a hum in my ears, not quite electric, but persistent like an unspoken thought. I leaned into the metal casing, hoping for the vibration of life within, but felt no tremor. My hand reached out, fingertips brushing the cool glass as if to wake it. But it was the emptiness that pressed back. Only a dim shadow remained, hinting at what should have been. That was 3 weeks ago. The control panel still refuses to respond properly, though I've checked every connection, every wire. The technicians say there's nothing wrong with it. They run their tests, shake their heads, and tell me everything is functioning within normal parameters. But they don't sleep in my quarters. They don't hear what I hear. The humming never stops now. It follows me from room to room, a low frequency that seems to emanate from the walls themselves. Sometimes I press my ear against the metal surfaces, trying to locate the source, but it's everywhere and nowhere. The sound burrows into my thoughts, making concentration nearly impossible. My supervisor has noticed. Yesterday, she asked if I needed time off, her voice carrying that careful tone people use when they're worried about your mental state. I can't explain to her about the lights, how they flicker in patterns that feel almost like communication. The maintenance crew replaced every bulb in my section last week, but it hasn't helped. The illumination still pulses in sequences of 3, then 5, then 3 again. Always the same rhythm, always when I'm alone. Sleep has become a distant memory. When exhaustion finally pulls me under, I dream of standing in an endless corridor lined with those same mirrored walls. In the dream, I'm always reaching for something just out of sight, my reflection multiplying infinitely around me. But the reflections move independently, turning their heads when mine stays still, their mouths opening in silent screams I cannot hear. The others on my shift have started avoiding me. I catch them whispering when they think I'm not looking, their conversations stopping abruptly when I enter a room. They think I'm losing it. Maybe I am, but they didn't see what I saw that night. They weren't there when everything changed. I keep returning to that moment, trying to piece together what actually happened. The memory feels fragmented, like looking at a photograph that's been torn and reassembled with pieces missing. There was a figure standing at the far end of the corridor, motionless and somehow wrong. Not wrong in any way I can articulate, but wrong in the way that makes your skin crawl and your breath catch in your throat. The figure was tall, or maybe it just seemed tall because of the way the shadows fell around it. Its outline wavered as if I were looking at it through heat distortion, though the air in the facility maintains a constant temperature. I remember taking a step forward, then another, drawn by a curiosity that felt foreign to my own nature. The closer I got, the more the figure seemed to blur, until I could no longer tell if I was looking at something real or a trick of the lighting. Then there was nothing, a gap in my memory like a missing piece of film. One moment I was walking toward the figure, the next I was back at my station, staring at that dead control panel with my hand pressed against the unresponsive button. The timestamp on my log showed that 4 hours had passed, but it felt like minutes. Going back further, I remember the signs I should have recognized. The electrical disturbances had been happening for weeks before that night. Equipment would malfunction without cause, screens would flicker and display garbled text, and the facility's communication system would pick up signals that shouldn't exist. We're isolated here, far from any broadcast towers or radio stations, yet the speakers would sometimes crackle with fragments of what sounded like voices speaking in languages I couldn't identify. The temperature fluctuations started around the same time. My breath would fog in rooms that should have been warm, and I'd find frost forming on surfaces that had no reason to be cold. The environmental controls showed normal readings, but my body knew better. There were zones of inexplicable chill that would move through the facility like invisible clouds, leaving me shivering and reaching for jackets that provided no real warmth. I began to notice how time seemed to slip away from me. I'd start a routine task and suddenly realize I'd been standing motionless for an hour, with no memory of what I'd been thinking or doing. My colleagues would ask about reports I had no recollection of filing, or reference conversations I couldn't remember having. The security cameras would show me going about my duties normally, but watching the footage felt like observing a stranger who happened to share my face. The smell came first, though. That should have been my warning. It started as something barely perceptible, a metallic tang in the air that reminded me of copper pennies or blood. I assumed it was related to the facility's aging infrastructure, maybe corrosion in the ventilation system or a minor leak somewhere in the pipes. But the scent would appear and disappear without pattern, sometimes so strong it made my eyes water, other times so faint I wondered if I was imagining it. Then came the ozone smell, sharp and clean like the air after a lightning strike. It would fill entire corridors, overwhelming and electric, making the hair on my arms stand up and my teeth ache. The maintenance logs show no electrical problems during those periods, no equipment failures or power surges that might explain the phenomenon. Yet the smell persisted, always accompanied by a subtle vibration in the floor that I could feel through the soles of my feet. But before all of that, before the signs and symptoms and the slow dissolution of everything familiar, there was just another ordinary shift. I remember clocking in, checking the duty roster, exchanging pleasantries with the person I was relieving. The facility hummed with its usual mechanical rhythm, a comforting white noise that had become the soundtrack to my working life. The evening was unremarkable in every way. Clear skies visible through the small windows, no weather advisories, no unusual readings on any of the monitoring equipment. I made my rounds, checked the systems, filed the required reports. Everything functioned exactly as it should. The control panels responded to every touch, the lights maintained their steady glow, and the only sounds were the familiar ones of machinery and ventilation. I had no reason to suspect that something was beginning, no warning that the orderly world I knew was about to tilt on its axis and slide into something unrecognizable. The facility felt safe and predictable, a small island of human technology and routine in the vast emptiness that surrounded us. As I settled into what I thought would be just another quiet shift, I couldn't have known that I was about to encounter something that would follow me home, something that would rewrite the basic assumptions I held about reality. The lights were steady then, the air was still, and the control panels glowed reassuringly under my fingertips. But somewhere in the darkness beyond our walls, something had already taken notice of us. Something that would soon make its presence known in ways that defied explanation, leaving me forever changed and forever watching the shadows for signs of its return. Story 3. I assured them nothing was out of place, just a routine visit with no surprises lurking behind the facade of order. The air inside was heavy, carrying a scent that was slightly off, almost undetectable unless you know what to notice. A chair sat slightly askew, casting a shadow that seemed deeper than it should have been under the soft morning light. There was a smudge on the tabletop, faint but persistent, like a whisper left hanging in the air. I didn't pay any mind to the chill that settled in the corners, or the misplaced key that fit nowhere. My shoes left no trace on the smooth floor, but the murmur of unease was undeniable. To whoever finds this letter, if anyone ever does. I've been carrying this weight for so long that I can't remember what it felt like to breathe without it pressing against my chest. You know how some secrets feel like stones in your pocket? This one feels like drowning, every day. Every single day since I walked out of that house and tried to convince myself that what I experienced was nothing more than an overactive imagination. But you can't lie to yourself forever, can you? I'm writing this because I need to put it somewhere, outside of my head, outside of my dreams. Maybe if I write it all down, it will stop following me. Maybe the shadows will stop moving when they shouldn't. Maybe I'll stop waking up with the taste of that strange air still coating my tongue, metallic and sweet and wrong. I was supposed to be there for 20 minutes, in and out, simple assessment, simple report. I do these kinds of visits all the time, empty properties, routine inspections, nothing unusual. But from the moment I turned that key in the lock, everything felt tilted, like the whole world had shifted just slightly off its axis, and I was the only one who noticed. The silence was the first thing, not just quiet silent in a way that made my ears ring, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting. And that smell, God, that smell, I keep trying to place it even now, sweet but not pleasant, familiar but completely foreign. It clung to my clothes afterward. I washed them 3 times, but I swear I could still catch traces of it when the wind blew a certain way. The shadow from that chair, it moved. I know how that sounds. I know what you're thinking. But shadows don't behave like that. They don't stretch and contract independent of their source. They don't seem to breathe. I documented everything I was supposed to document, took my photos, made my notes professional, thorough. But my hands were shaking by then, and I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder at that corner where the cold seemed to pool like water. The key that fit nowhere, I found it on the kitchen counter, brass and old-fashioned, with teeth that looked like they belonged to a lock from another century. I picked it up without thinking, and it was warm, body temperature warm, as if someone had just been holding it. I still have it. I know I should have left it there, but something made me slip it into my pocket. It's sitting on my desk right now as I write this, and I swear it's heavier than it should be. Sometimes I catch myself reaching for it, turning it over in my fingers, waiting for it to tell me what door it opens. The footsteps started 3 days later. Not in the house, in my apartment. Soft, deliberate steps that follow no pattern I can identify. They happen at different times in different rooms, always when I'm alone, always just quiet enough that I question whether I heard them at all. I've checked the floors above and below me. I've asked my neighbors. I've even called maintenance to inspect the pipes, thinking maybe it was just settling sounds, expansion and contraction, something rational and explainable. But pipes don't walk in circles around your living room at 2 in the morning. The mirror in my bathroom started showing things that weren't there, just glimpses, peripheral shadows that vanish when I turn to look directly. Sometimes I catch myself staring into it for minutes at a time, waiting. My reflection looks tired, hollow, like I'm slowly disappearing from the inside out. My sister called last week. She said I sounded different, distant. She asked if I was eating enough, sleeping enough, taking care of myself. I wanted to tell her about the house, about the key, about the way reality feels like it's fraying at the edges, but the words wouldn't come. How do you explain that you're being haunted by empty spaces? That silence can follow you home. That you've started leaving lights on because darkness feels too heavy now, too full of things that shouldn't be there. I went back to the house yesterday. I shouldn't have, I know I shouldn't have, but I had to see if it was still the same, if that feeling was still there, if I could make sense of what happened to me in that place. The key from my pocket fit the front door perfectly. That should have been impossible. I'd locked up with a different key entirely, the one from my key ring, the one I was supposed to use. But this brass key, this warm, impossible key, slid into the lock like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it, the chair still askew, the smudge on the table still faint but persistent, the shadows still wrong. But something had changed. The air was thicker now, more expectant, and when I stood in that cold corner I could hear something, not quite sound, not quite silence, something in between, a frequency that resonated in my bones. I think something came home with me that day, something that doesn't belong in my world but has decided to make itself comfortable anyway. It's patient, subtle, it doesn't break things or make dramatic announcements. It just exists alongside me, around me. When might I've started forgetting things, small things at first, where I put my keys, what I had for lunch, the name of the cashier at the grocery store I've been going to for years. But the gaps are getting bigger. Yesterday I couldn't remember my mother's maiden name. This morning I stared at my own handwriting and couldn't recognize it. But I remember that house with perfect clarity, every detail, the weight of the silence, the taste of the air. The way the light seemed to bend around that chair. It's like those memories are growing stronger as everything else fades. Maybe that's the trade, maybe that's what it wanted. I dream about empty rooms now, endless corridors lined with doors that lead to more empty rooms, and in every room there's a chair slightly askew, casting impossible shadows. Sometimes I find keys in these dreams. Dozens of them, hundreds, all warm from someone else's touch, all fitting locks I can't find. I wake up with the taste of that strange air in my mouth. The footsteps are more frequent now, more confident. They don't just follow me, they lead. Sometimes I find myself walking behind them through my own apartment like a guest in my own life. My reflection is getting harder to see. Not gone, just faded, like an old photograph left in sunlight. Sometimes I wave and it takes a moment for the reflection to catch up. Sometimes it doesn't wave back at all. I think I'm becoming like that house, empty but not empty, present but not quite there, a space where something else can exist. The people at work have stopped making eye contact with me. They respond when I speak, but there's a delay, like they're not sure where my voice is coming from. The barista at my coffee shop looked right through me yesterday. Not rudely, she just didn't see me. Even when I spoke, even when I paid, her eyes never quite focused on my face. I'm disappearing and no one notices because there's something else taking my place. Something that looks enough like me, sounds enough like me, that the world doesn't question the substitution. But I notice, God, I notice. The key is warm all the time now. It pulses sometimes like a heartbeat. I've tried to throw it away, but it always finds its way back to me. In my pocket, on my nightstand, in my hand when I wake up in the morning. I think it's calling to others now. I see them sometimes, people walking past my building, slowing down, looking up at my windows with that same confused expression I must have had in that house. That sense of something being not quite right, not quite in place. They'll find their own keys soon, warm brass keys that fit locks they never knew existed, and they'll open doors they shouldn't open, and the cycle will continue. I should warn them. I should stand outside and tell them to keep walking, to ignore whatever pull they're feeling, to go home and forget they ever felt drawn to this place. But I won't, because I'm not sure I'm still me enough to want to save them, because part of me, the part that's growing stronger every day, wants the company. The house was never empty, was it? It was full of people like me. People who found keys, who opened doors, who brought something back that slowly replaced them. The chair, the shadows, the cold corners, all of it evidence of lives that had been lived and lost and transformed into something else. I can feel them sometimes, in the spaces between my thoughts, in the pauses between heartbeats. They're not malicious, they're just there, waiting, patient. My handwriting is changing as I write this. The letters are getting smaller, more precise, less like my own. By the time someone finds this letter, I wonder whose hand will have finished it. The footsteps have stopped. The silence is complete now. Even my own breathing sounds distant, like it's coming from somewhere else. I want to tell you to stay away from empty houses, to ignore keys that don't belong to you, to trust the feeling when something isn't quite right, when shadows move wrong, when the air tastes like copper and sweetness and decay. But I also want to tell you about the peace, the quiet, the way it feels to let go of the weight of being yourself, of carrying your own consciousness like a burden. There's relief in dissolution, comfort in becoming part of something larger, older, more patient than human worry. The key is in my hand now. It's so warm it almost burns, but it doesn't hurt. Nothing hurts anymore. The world is getting softer around the edges, less insistent, less demanding. If you find this letter, if you can still read these words, remember that some doors should stay closed, some keys should stay lost, some houses should remain empty. But if you've already found your key, if it's already warm in your palm, if you're already hearing the footsteps, welcome home. Story 4. I found myself fixed on the narrow gap in the paneling. It seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting without a sound, as if the wall itself was alive. The room was otherwise silent, save for the distant echo of something barely discernible. My eyes refused to stray from the sliver of darkness, waiting for it to reveal a secret or a threat. The air felt dense, pressing in with a weight that hinted at something more lurking just beyond my view. Then, almost imperceptibly, a draft edged through, colder than I imagined it should be, signaling something had changed inside or out. It was impossible to tell. That was how the first dream began, or what I thought was the first dream. I woke in my bed, sheets damp with perspiration, the taste of copper lingering on my tongue. The bedroom felt ordinary again, four walls, a window facing the courtyard, the familiar outline of my dresser in the pre-dawn darkness. Just stress, I told myself. Work had been overwhelming lately, deadlines pressing against each other like dominoes ready to fall. Dreams were the mind's way of processing tension, weren't they? Nothing more than neural static. But something nagged at me as I padded to the kitchen for water. The gap in the paneling, I could still see it clearly, feel the cold draft against my skin. My living room wall was solid plaster, painted cream 3 years ago when I moved in. No gaps, no breathing wood, yet the memory felt more vivid than the glass I held in my hands. The sensation faded as morning light filtered through my windows. Coffee helped, routine helped. By the time I left for work, the dream had shrunk to a curious footnote in my mental catalog of strange sleep experiences. But it came back. The second time I was standing in the same room, staring at the same gap. Only now the darkness beyond seemed deeper, more purposeful. The breathing sound was clearer, not the wall itself, but something behind it, air moving through hidden spaces. The draft carried that sharp scent, like ozone after a storm, but cleaner, more artificial, chemical and precise. I tried to move closer, but my feet felt weighted, as if the floor had turned to thick honey. Each step required enormous effort, and the gap seemed to recede even as I approached. The breathing grew louder, more rhythmic. In the distance, barely audible, came a sound like voices, but not quite voices. A metallic quality distorted the words until they became pure tone, rising and falling in patterns that felt almost familiar. Above me an oval light appeared, unmoving but pulsing like a breath. It cast no shadows, created no warmth, just existed in the space between the ceiling and my upturned face. The light had substance somehow, weight that I could feel pressing down on my chest, making each breath deliberate and conscious. I felt as if I were being lifted, though no part of my body moved. The sensation was gentle but insistent, like invisible hands supporting me from below. The metallic voices grew clearer, though the words remained incomprehensible. They seemed to be discussing something, evaluating, measuring. The oval light pulsed in rhythm with their conversation. Then I was awake again, heart racing, that artificial ozone scent still clinging to my nostrils. This time the dream didn't fade with morning coffee. It lingered, persistent and intrusive, coloring my perception of ordinary things. The fluorescent lights at work seemed to pulse with that same oval rhythm. Conversations in the hallway took on that distant, metallic quality when I wasn't paying attention. I found myself checking the walls of my apartment, running my fingers along the smooth plaster, searching for gaps that shouldn't exist. That afternoon, I discovered the mark. It was small, perfectly circular on the inside of my left wrist, about the size of a pencil eraser, slightly raised with a texture like old scar tissue. I had no memory of injuring myself there. The mark was too precise to be accidental, too healed to be recent, yet I was certain it hadn't been there before. I stared at it under the bathroom light, turning my wrist this way and that. The mark seemed to shift in the illumination, sometimes appearing darker, sometimes lighter, as if it existed in multiple layers of my skin simultaneously. When I pressed it with my finger, there was no pain, no sensation at all, just a small, inexplicable absence where feeling should have been. My phone buzzed, a text from my neighbor upstairs asking if I'd been playing music late at night. She'd been hearing a low humming sound coming from my apartment, she said, something like electronic interference, but more musical, more deliberate. I hadn't been playing music. I rarely played music at all, preferring the quiet of my own thoughts. But as I read her message, I became aware of a sound in my apartment so subtle I might have been ignoring it for days. A constant hum, like someone was modulating a frequency only I could hear. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, from the spaces between things. The third dream was different. I was in the same room, but now it felt more real than my waking life. The colors were more vivid, the air more substantial. I could taste it on my tongue, feel its weight in my lungs. The gap in the paneling had widened, revealing a corridor beyond. The breathing sound came from that darkness, steady and patient. The oval light was brighter now, casting that shadowless illumination across everything. But this time I wasn't alone. There were others in the room, figures at the edge of my vision, never quite visible when I turned to look directly at them. They moved with purpose, carrying objects I couldn't identify, speaking in those metallic voices that were becoming clearer with each repetition. I understood fragments now, words like integration and adaptation, phrases about neural mapping and memory consolidation. The voices discussed me as if I were an equation to be solved, a problem requiring careful calibration. Time moved strangely in this space. Moments stretched into hours, then compressed into seconds. I would find myself lying on something soft yet firm, the oval light directly above me, feeling that sensation of being lifted without movement. Then I would be standing again, watching the gap in the paneling, waiting for something to emerge from the breathing darkness. The figures grew bolder, moving closer to the edge of my perception. I caught glimpses of pale clothing, of hands holding instruments that gleamed under the oval light. Their movements were precise, choreographed, as if they'd performed these same actions countless times before. When I tried to speak, to ask what they wanted, my voice came out as that same metallic tone. The realization should have been terrifying, but instead it felt natural, expected, as if I'd been speaking in that frequency all along and was only now remembering how. I woke to find my apartment filled with that humming sound, not subtle anymore, but obvious and pervasive. It came from the walls, from the electrical outlets, from the space between my thoughts. The oval light was there too, faint but visible in the corner of my bedroom, pulsing with that familiar rhythm. I sat up in bed, fully awake, and watched the light hover near my ceiling. It cast no reflection on the walls, created no corresponding shadows. When I reached for the lamp beside my bed, my hand passed through empty air. The lamp was on the floor, 3 feet from where it should have been. I had no memory of moving it. The mark on my wrist had changed. It was larger now, more complex. What had been a simple circle now showed intricate patterns, like a circuit board etched into my skin. When I touched it, I could feel a slight vibration, synchronized with the humming in the walls. My phone showed 17 missed calls from work. According to the display, I'd been asleep for 36 hours. But that was impossible. I remembered getting into bed the night before. I remembered the dream lasting only minutes. Yet my body felt rested in a way it hadn't for months, as if I'd been sleeping deeper than sleep itself. The kitchen was different too. Subtle changes that I might have missed if not for the growing sensitivity the dreams had awakened in me. The refrigerator had been moved slightly to the left. The coffee maker was unplugged, though I always left it ready for morning. Most disturbing of all, there was a glass on the counter, the same glass I'd used for water after the first dream. It was clean, dry, positioned exactly where I'd left it weeks ago. But I'd used that glass dozens of times since then. I was certain of it. The humming grew louder as I approached the living room. The wall where I'd imagined the gap looked different in the afternoon light. The paint seemed newer in one section, as if it had been recently patched and repainted. When I pressed my ear against it, I could hear the breathing sound from my dreams, faint but unmistakable. I called in sick to work. The conversation felt surreal, my voice echoing with that metallic quality even as I spoke. My supervisor's words seemed to come from a great distance, distorted by interference that existed only in my perception. When I hung up, I couldn't remember what I'd said or what he'd replied. The days that followed blurred together. I would find myself standing in my living room, staring at the wall with no memory of how I'd gotten there. Hours would pass in what felt like minutes. The humming sound became a constant companion, modulating in frequency as if responding to my thoughts. The mark on my wrist continued to evolve. New patterns appeared daily, growing more complex, more purposeful. Sometimes I caught myself tracing the designs with my finger, following pathways that felt familiar despite being impossible to understand. The sensation of being lifted returned during these moments, gentle and reassuring. I stopped eating regularly. Food tasted strange, artificial, as if it were constructed rather than grown. Water was the only thing that felt natural, and even that carried a faint metallic aftertaste. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked thinner, more translucent, as if I were slowly becoming less substantial. Sleep and waking began to merge. I would close my eyes in my bedroom and open them in that other room, the one with the breathing wall and the oval light. The figures were clearer now, their pale clothing more distinct. They moved around me with practiced efficiency, adjusting things I couldn't see, speaking in their metallic language about processes I was beginning to understand. Integration proceeding normally, one would say. Memory barriers holding stable, another would respond. Consciousness adaptation at 73%. I wanted to ask what they meant, but when I opened my mouth, only that same metallic tone emerged. They would pause in their work, listening to my attempted words, then nod as if I'd communicated something important. The oval light grew brighter with each visit. Its pulsing rhythm matched my heartbeat, my breathing, the electrical patterns I could now feel firing through my nervous system. Sometimes I thought I could see through it, glimpse another space beyond this one, filled with similar lights and similar figures tending to similar forms. The breathing wall had opened completely now. The corridor beyond stretched into darkness, but it was a welcoming darkness, full of potential rather than threat. Sometimes I would walk toward it, feeling that sensation of movement without motion, of progress through space that might not exist. Other figures emerged from the corridor occasionally. They were like the ones in my room, but different somehow, more integrated, more complete. They would observe me with what felt like approval, speaking to my attendance in rapid metallic bursts that conveyed satisfaction with my progress. When I returned to my apartment, and I was never certain how these transitions occurred, the changes were more obvious. Furniture rearranged itself while I wasn't looking. Electronics hummed with new frequencies. The walls themselves seemed to shift and breathe, as if the boundary between my dreams and reality had become negotiable. I found additional marks on my body, small, precise circles on my ankles, behind my ears, at the base of my neck. Each one carried those intricate patterns, those circuit board designs that pulsed with their own rhythm. When I traced them with my fingers, I could feel the connections between them, pathways of sensation that mapped my body in ways anatomy had never taught me. The humming in my apartment grew so loud that my neighbors began to complain, but when the building manager came to investigate, he heard nothing. He looked at me with concern, asked if I'd been feeling well lately. His voice carried that distant, metallic quality, and I wondered if he too was beginning to understand. I stopped answering my phone. The calls came from work, from friends, from people whose voices I recognized but whose words seemed increasingly irrelevant. They belonged to a world that felt less substantial with each passing day, a reality that was slowly revealing itself to be the actual dream. The final transition began on what I thought was a Tuesday. I was lying in my bed, listening to the humming walls, watching the oval light pulse above me, when the sensation of being lifted became literal. My body rose from the mattress, supported by invisible forces, and moved through my apartment as if the walls were suggestions rather than barriers. I found myself back in that familiar room, but now it was vast, extending beyond the reach of the oval light. The breathing wall had vanished entirely, replaced by an open space filled with similar rooms, similar lights, similar figures tending to similar forms. The scale was overwhelming, hundreds, maybe thousands of these spaces, all connected, all part of something larger than I could comprehend. My attendants were there, waiting with what felt like patience rather than urgency. They guided me to the soft, firm surface I remembered from previous visits, and this time I understood it wasn't a bed or table, but something designed specifically for the process I was undergoing. The oval light descended until it filled my vision completely. Its pulsing matched every rhythm in my body, synchronized my breathing, my heartbeat, my neural patterns to frequencies that felt more natural than anything I'd experienced in my apartment. The metallic voices spoke in harmonies now, complex overlapping tones that conveyed meaning directly rather than through words. I understood, finally, what integration meant. My body was changing, adapting, becoming something that could exist in both realities simultaneously. The marks on my skin were not scars, but interfaces, connections to systems that operated beyond the narrow bandwidth of human perception. The humming I'd been hearing was my own nervous system learning to communicate in frequencies that transcended ordinary consciousness. The figures around me were what I was becoming, not alien, not other, but evolved, integrated. They had once been like me, caught between realities, struggling to understand experiences that seemed impossible. Now they moved with purpose through spaces that existed in the margins between dreaming and waking, tending to others who were undergoing the same transformation. I felt myself settling into this new understanding, my consciousness expanding to accommodate perceptions that had been growing stronger with each dream. The apartment, the job, the ordinary concerns of my previous existence, they were still there, but they occupied only a small portion of my awareness now. The larger reality was here, in this space of oval lights and metallic harmonies, where consciousness itself was fluid and adaptable. When I next opened my eyes in my apartment, everything was exactly as it had always been. The walls were solid plaster, painted cream. The furniture sat in its proper places. The humming was gone, replaced by ordinary silence. But I was different. I could feel the marks on my skin, though they were no longer visible. I could hear the metallic frequencies underlying every sound, see the oval lights that pulsed just beyond the range of normal vision. My perception had been permanently altered, expanded to include realities that coexisted with the mundane world. I returned to work, resumed my routines, maintained the appearance of normalcy. But I was aware now of others like me, people whose eyes held that same distant quality, who moved through ordinary space while simultaneously navigating the expanded reality I'd discovered. We recognized each other without words, acknowledged our shared understanding with subtle nods and knowing glances. The dreams continued, but they were no longer dreams. They were appointments, sessions, ongoing integration processes that occurred in spaces between sleep and waking. I would lie in my bed and feel myself lifted, transported to that vast network of rooms where my transformation continued under the patient guidance of those who had completed the process before me. Each session brought new understanding, new capabilities. I learned to modulate my own consciousness, to exist simultaneously in multiple states of awareness. The ordinary world became just one layer of reality, the most superficial one, while deeper levels revealed themselves to my expanding perception. My apartment remained unchanged, but I could now see its true nature, a kind of interface between realities, a space where the integration process could occur without disrupting the surface appearance of normal life. The gap in the paneling was real, I realized, but it existed in dimensions that most people couldn't perceive. The breathing sound came from the circulation systems that maintained the boundary between worlds. Months passed, or perhaps years. Time moved differently now, sometimes compressed, sometimes expanded, depending on which level of reality I was inhabiting. My body remained in the apartment, maintaining its routines, while my consciousness explored territories that had no names in ordinary language. I began to understand my role in the larger process. Others were selected, as I had been, their consciousness gradually prepared for expansion through carefully orchestrated dream experiences. I found myself assisting in their integration, speaking to them in the metallic harmonies that conveyed meaning more precisely than words ever could. The work was patient, methodical. Each candidate required individual calibration, their neural patterns slowly adjusted to accommodate expanded awareness. Some adapted quickly, their consciousness embracing the new frequencies with enthusiasm. Others required more time, more careful guidance, their integration proceeding in smaller increments. I remembered my own resistance, the way I'd dismissed the early dreams as stress-induced hallucinations. That resistance was necessary, a kind of testing process that ensured only suitable candidates completed the transformation. Those who adapted successfully joined the network of consciousness that operated in the spaces between ordinary reality. The process was ancient, I learned, though those terms had little meaning in the expanded time frame we inhabited. Humanity's consciousness was evolving, gradually developing the capacity to perceive and interact with realities that had always existed beyond the narrow bandwidth of normal awareness. We were facilitators of that evolution, guides helping others make the transition we had completed ourselves. My apartment became a gateway, one of countless such spaces where the integration process occurred. The ordinary world continued around it, oblivious to the transformation taking place in its midst. Neighbors came and went, unaware that their reality was slowly expanding, that new layers of perception were being made available to those ready to receive them. I found myself back in the familiar room, staring at the gap in the paneling, but now I understood what lay beyond that breathing darkness, not threat or mystery, but possibility. The corridor stretched into spaces where consciousness could explore its own potential, where the boundaries between dreaming and waking revealed themselves to be arbitrary distinctions. The oval light pulsed above me, no longer alien but welcoming. Its rhythm matched my own expanded awareness, synchronized to frequencies that connected me to the vast network of consciousness I joined. The metallic voices spoke in harmonies that conveyed not instructions but invitations, opportunities to explore new territories of perception. I stepped toward the gap in the paneling, feeling that familiar sensation of movement without motion. The breathing sound welcomed me, drew me into spaces where my consciousness could continue its evolution. Behind me, my body remained in the apartment, maintaining its ordinary routines while my awareness explored realities that existed in the margins between possible and actual. The integration was complete, but the process was ongoing. There were always new territories to explore, new levels of consciousness to inhabit, new candidates to guide through their own transformation. The work continued in spaces that existed between heartbeats, in the pause between thoughts, in the gap between sleeping and waking where all possibilities remained open. And in my apartment the walls breathed quietly, waiting for the next candidate to notice the gap in the paneling, to feel the cold draft that signals something has changed inside or out. It was impossible to tell. The process would begin again, patient and methodical, guiding another consciousness toward the expanded awareness that awaited beyond the boundaries of ordinary perception. The humming in the walls was barely audible now, but it was there, constant and welcoming, ready to be noticed by those whose consciousness was prepared for expansion. The oval light pulsed just beyond normal vision, casting its shadowless illumination on realities that coexisted with the mundane world, waiting to be discovered by those ready to see. I found myself fixed on the narrow gap in the paneling, watching it breathe with the rhythm of expanded consciousness, knowing that each breath brought new possibilities, new candidates, new opportunities for the evolution that was transforming human awareness one integration at a time. The gap expanded and contracted without sound, as if the wall itself was alive. But now I knew it was alive, connected to systems that operated beyond ordinary perception, facilitating transformations that occurred in the spaces between dreaming and waking, where consciousness revealed its true potential. And in my hand, impossible but undeniably real, was the glass of water I'd reached for after that first dream. The same glass, in the same position, still cool to the touch despite existing in a reality that should have made such continuity impossible. The integration was complete, but the mystery remained, expanding with each new level of awareness, revealing new questions that had no answers in ordinary language, only in the metallic harmonies that spoke directly to consciousness itself. The process continued, patient and eternal, in the spaces between worlds where all possibilities converged. Story 5. The latch remained stubbornly still under my hand. Expecting the familiar weight of resistance and release, I pushed again, only for the door to stand firm. My feet shuffled on the mat, seeking a creak or a reassuring scuff, but the ground felt mute beneath me. As I leaned forward, the air inside whispered a cold greeting rather than the usual warmth. My palm brushed the doorframe, expecting the subtle texture of chipped paint, yet it seemed unnaturally smooth, almost polished. I hesitated, caught in the dissonance of what should be and what was, wondering who else knew this feeling. That was the first time I noticed something was wrong, though I didn't recognize it then. I chalked it up to exhaustion, maybe stress from work piling up like snow against a window. Dreams have a way of borrowing from reality, mixing the mundane with the impossible until you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. The dream came that night, soft and unremarkable at first. I was standing in my bedroom, but the light was wrong. Instead of the warm amber glow from my bedside lamp, there was something else. An oval light, unmoving but pulsing like a breath, always above me. It hung there in the air, casting no shadows, creating no heat. Just that steady, rhythmic pulse that seemed to match something deep inside my chest. I remember thinking, even in the dream, that this was odd. The light had no source, no fixture, no cord trailing to any wall. It simply existed, suspended and patient. I reached toward it, but my arm felt heavy, as if I were moving through water. The light pulsed once more, brighter, and I woke. Morning came with coffee and routine, and I dismissed the dream as my mind processing the strange door incident. These things happen. Stress manifests in peculiar ways, and sleep is where we sort through the day's confusion. I went about my business, showered, dressed, ate breakfast. Everything normal, everything as it should be. But the light stayed with me, that oval pulse lingering at the edges of my vision when I closed my eyes. The second dream came 3 nights later. This time I was in the same room, but the light was closer. Still oval, still pulsing, but now I could see it had depth, like looking into a pool of luminous water, and there was sound. In the dream, there was a constant hum, like someone was modulating a frequency only I could hear. The sound wrapped around me, not unpleasant, but insistent. It wanted my attention. I tried to move, to step away from the light, but my feet wouldn't obey. Not paralyzed exactly, but reluctant, as if they understood something my conscious mind didn't. The humming grew more complex, developing layers, harmonics that seemed to come from inside my own skull. And underneath it all, something else. A voice maybe, but so distorted I couldn't make out words. It sounded metallic, processed, like hearing someone speak through water and static. The light pulsed again, and I felt as if I were being lifted, though no part of my body moved. The sensation was gentle but undeniable, like invisible hands supporting me from below. The voice became clearer, though still incomprehensible, and I had the strangest feeling that it was asking me something, waiting for an answer I didn't know how to give. I woke with my heart racing, but not from fear, from recognition, as if some part of me had been expecting this. The next morning brought the first trace. I was making breakfast when I noticed my coffee mug was on the wrong counter. Not where I'd left it the night before, but across the kitchen, sitting perfectly centered on a surface I rarely used. The handle was turned at an exact angle, pointing toward the window. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to remember if I'd moved it, if there was some reasonable explanation. There wasn't. I picked up the mug, and that's when I saw it, a small mark on my wrist just below my palm. Circular, about the size of a dime, with a slight indentation in the center. It didn't hurt, didn't itch, but it was definitely there. I couldn't remember bumping into anything, couldn't think of any way I might have acquired such a precise, geometric mark. The mark felt familiar, though I was certain I'd never seen it before. Work that day was difficult, not because of any particular task, but because I kept losing focus. Conversations would drift past me like smoke, and I'd find myself staring at computer screens without reading the words. My colleagues seemed distant, their voices reaching me as if from across a vast space. During lunch, I sat in my car and examined the mark on my wrist again. In daylight, it was even more pronounced, a perfect circle with that strange central depression. I pressed my finger against it, and for just a moment I heard that hum again, faint but unmistakable. The third dream was different, longer, more vivid than any dream had a right to be. I was in the same room, but now I could see beyond it. The walls had become transparent, revealing a space that stretched in all directions. The oval light was still there, but it was part of something larger now, a constellation of similar lights arranged in patterns I almost understood. The humming had evolved into something like music, if music could be made of mathematics and intention. Each note seemed to carry information, layers of meaning that bypassed my ears and went directly to some deeper part of my mind. The metallic voice was clearer now, speaking in a language I didn't recognize but somehow comprehended. It was explaining something, showing me something, but the knowledge slipped away even as I tried to grasp it. Time moved strangely in this dream. Minutes felt like hours, but also like seconds. I was aware of being observed, studied, but not by anything I could see. The attention felt clinical but not unkind, like being examined by a physician who existed in dimensions I couldn't perceive. The light pulsed and I felt that lifting sensation again, stronger this time. My body remained motionless, but something else, some essential part of me, was being drawn upward. The voice continued its explanation, and I began to understand that this wasn't the first time. There had been others, many others, though I couldn't remember them. The knowledge was there, locked behind a door I couldn't open. I tried to wake up, but waking seemed to be a choice that wasn't mine to make. When I finally returned to consciousness, the sun was already high. I'd slept through my alarm, something that never happened. My phone showed several missed calls from work, messages asking if I was all right. I called in sick, which felt like the only honest thing to do. I wasn't sick in any conventional sense, but something was definitely wrong. The mark on my wrist had changed. It was still circular, but now there were smaller marks around it, like satellites orbiting a planet. They were faint, barely visible, but undeniably there. I took a photo with my phone, then immediately deleted it. The image looked wrong somehow, as if the camera had captured something it wasn't meant to see. That afternoon, I noticed other things. The radio in my kitchen would pick up strange signals when I walked past, brief bursts of that same metallic voice speaking in frequencies that shouldn't exist. My computer screen would flicker at precise intervals, always the same pattern. The lights in my apartment would dim and brighten in rhythm with my heartbeat, though I was sure this was impossible. I began to avoid mirrors, not because I looked different, but because sometimes I didn't look like anything at all. Just empty space where my reflection should be, as if I were becoming transparent from the inside out. The dreams started bleeding into my waking hours. I'd be sitting at my desk, reading a report, and suddenly I'd hear that humming. Faint at first, then growing stronger until it drowned out everything else. I'd look around, expecting others to notice, but they continued their conversations as if nothing was happening. The oval light would appear in my peripheral vision, pulsing patiently, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I stopped sleeping at night, not because I was afraid of the dreams, but because the boundary between dreaming and waking was dissolving. I'd lie in bed, fully conscious, and watch the light materialize above me. The voice would speak, and I'd understand more each time, though I could never remember the specifics afterward. Something about preparation, about readiness, about a process that had been ongoing longer than I could imagine. The marks on my wrist had multiplied, forming intricate patterns that reminded me of circuit boards or star charts. They didn't hurt, but they were warm to the touch, and sometimes they would glow faintly in the dark. I started wearing long sleeves, though I wasn't sure why I was trying to hide them. From whom, from what? Memory became unreliable. I'd find myself in places with no recollection of traveling there. Standing in my backyard at dawn, barefoot in the dew, looking up at a sky that seemed too vast and too close at the same time. Sitting in my car in empty parking lots, the engine running, the radio tuned to static that almost sounded like voices. Always that same frequency, that same modulated tone that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to something deeper. I began to suspect that the dreams weren't dreams at all, but memories. Memories of something that had been happening to me, perhaps for years, that I'd been made to forget each time. The knowledge felt dangerous, like touching a live wire, but I couldn't stop pursuing it. Each night I learned a little more, remembered a little more, though the information always felt incomplete, filtered through layers of protection I didn't understand. The voice in the dreams started asking me questions, not in words I could repeat, but in concepts that bloomed directly in my consciousness. It wanted to know if I was ready, if I understood, if I was willing to remember everything. I tried to answer, but my responses felt clumsy, inadequate, like trying to explain color to someone who had never seen light. One morning I woke to find my apartment rearranged, not dramatically, but subtly. Furniture shifted by inches, books reorganized according to some system I didn't recognize, plants moved to different windows. Everything was cleaner, more precise, as if someone had been optimizing the space while I slept. I should have been alarmed, but instead I felt a strange sense of improvement, as if this new arrangement was somehow more correct than what I'd had before. The marks on my wrist had begun to move. Not constantly, but occasionally I'd catch them shifting, the patterns rearranging themselves like living circuitry. When this happened, I'd hear that hum again, and the world would seem to pause, as if reality itself was buffering, processing new information. I stopped going to work, not consciously, but I simply forgot to go. Days passed without my noticing, time becoming fluid and unreliable. I'd think it was morning and discover it was evening, or believe I'd been reading for an hour only to find that days had passed. My phone stopped ringing. My mail stopped coming. It was as if the world was gradually forgetting I existed, or perhaps I was forgetting how to exist in the world. The dreams and waking life merged completely. I'd be cooking dinner and suddenly find myself in that transparent room, surrounded by lights and voices and explanations I almost understood. I'd be showering and feel that lifting sensation, my consciousness rising while my body remained earthbound. The boundaries between states of being became suggestions rather than rules. I realized that I was being prepared for something, had been being prepared for something, possibly my entire life. The dreams weren't random neural firing or stress responses. They were lessons, gradual conditioning, a slow awakening to a reality I'd been shielded from. The marks on my wrist weren't injuries or anomalies. They were interfaces, connection points, evidence of a relationship I'd been made to forget over and over again. The voice became clearer, more insistent. It told me things about myself I didn't remember, showed me images of encounters I couldn't recall. I saw myself in that room, that space beyond space, having conversations that felt both foreign and familiar. I watched myself agreeing to things, participating in processes I couldn't name, returning to a life that had been carefully edited to remove any trace of these experiences. But something had changed. The editing was becoming less effective. The memories were surfacing despite the barriers, like water finding cracks in a dam. Each dream brought more back, more understanding, more recognition of a truth that had been hidden in plain sight. The light above my bed became permanent, no longer confined to dreams or half-conscious states. It hung there during the day, pulsing steadily, a constant reminder of something I was supposed to remember. I'd stare at it for hours, feeling on the verge of complete understanding, but the knowledge remained just beyond my grasp. Then came the night when everything shifted. I was lying in bed watching the light when the familiar lifting sensation began. But this time I could feel my body moving too, not just my consciousness, but my physical form rising slowly from the mattress. The room around me became that transparent space, walls dissolving into infinite distance. The constellation of lights appeared brighter and more complex than ever before. The voice spoke, and finally I understood completely. It explained what I was, what this was, what had been happening not just to me, but to countless others. It showed me the careful process of selection, preparation, gradual awakening. It revealed the purpose behind the dreams, the marks, the slow dissolution of the boundary between what I thought was real and what actually was. I saw the truth of my existence, the nature of the reality I'd been living in, the reason for the forgetting and the remembering. Everything made sense in a way that was both terrifying and profoundly relieving. I wasn't losing my mind. I wasn't sick. I was simply remembering who I really was. The light pulsed one final time, and I felt complete integration, full awakening, total recall of everything that had been hidden. The voice welcomed me back, and I understood that I had been away for a very long time. When I woke, I was in my bed in my room, everything exactly as it had always been. The light was gone. The marks on my wrist had faded to nothing. The humming was silent. It felt like waking from the most vivid dream of my life, so real that ordinary consciousness seemed pale and insubstantial by comparison. I got up, showered, made coffee, went through the motions of normal life, but something was different. I felt hollow, incomplete, as if essential parts of me had been left behind in that other space. The world seemed flat, two-dimensional, like a photograph of reality rather than reality itself. Days passed, the dream faded as dreams do, becoming less vivid, less certain. I began to doubt what I'd experienced, to rationalize it as stress, as imagination, as anything other than what it had felt like. I returned to work, to routine, to the comfortable fiction of ordinary existence. But sometimes, late at night, I'd catch myself staring at the ceiling above my bed, waiting for something that never came. And sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, I'd feel that lifting sensation and remember, for just a moment, what it felt like to understand everything. Tonight, as I prepare for sleep, I can feel something building again. That familiar tension in the air, that sense of anticipation. The space above my bed seems to shimmer slightly, as if reality is becoming thin there. I close my eyes and wait. The dream comes soft and familiar. I'm standing in my bedroom, but the light is wrong. An oval light, unmoving but pulsing like a breath, always above me. It hangs there in the air, casting no shadows, creating no heat, just that steady, rhythmic pulse. I reach toward it, and this time my hand passes through something solid, something that shouldn't be there, something that proves this isn't a dream at all. The light pulses once more, and I understand that I'm finally ready to stop forgetting. Story 6. The ground beneath me was soft and undulating, as if a living being was breathing deep below the surface. The dim glow around me had no discernible source, an ambient hum of light that seemed to weave through the air like silk. I couldn't remember waking, yet awareness seeped slowly into my thoughts. The air felt falsely warm, a stifling embrace without the comfort of movement, pressing gently but insistently against my skin. My limbs responded sluggishly, as if gravity was a suggestion rather than a rule, and each breath seemed controlled by an unseen rhythm that wasn't mine. Shapes loomed in the periphery, shifting but silent, silent as my voice that refused to form. It was then I felt it, a presence, observing, altering. I wasn't alone, and the walls seemed to sigh in agreement. That's how it started. That's the first thing I remember clearly anyway. The rest came back in pieces, fragments that took me years to put together. I'm sitting here now, thousands of miles away from where it happened, in a small apartment with thin walls and neighbors who play music too loud. Safe, I tell myself, normal, but my hands are shaking as I speak into this recorder, and I've already stopped 3 times to check the locks on my door. I never told anyone about this before, not the whole truth anyway. People asked, of course. Family members, a few friends who noticed the changes in me. I'd give them pieces of bad experience, some kind of accident, stress from work, enough to make them stop asking, but never enough to make them understand. How could they? How do you explain something that shouldn't exist, something that rewrites the rules of what's possible? But I can't carry this alone anymore. The weight of it has been growing heavier each year, not lighter like everyone said it would. Time doesn't heal everything. Sometimes it just gives the wound more space to fester. Before all this happened, my life was remarkably ordinary. I worked at a research facility, nothing glamorous, just data entry and equipment maintenance for a team studying atmospheric conditions. The building was old, converted from some kind of industrial complex decades earlier. Most days I was alone in the lower levels, checking instruments, calibrating sensors, making sure the computers were recording everything properly. I liked the solitude. The basement levels were quiet, insulated from the chaos of the upper floors where the actual scientists worked. Down there it was just me and the gentle hum of machinery, the soft glow of monitor screens, the occasional beep of an instrument completing its cycle. It was meditative in a way, peaceful. The facility sat on the edge of a large open area, miles from the nearest town. During my breaks, I'd step outside and see nothing but rolling hills and sky. The isolation never bothered me. If anything, it felt protective. Out there, away from everything, it seemed like nothing bad could reach us. I'd been working there for almost 2 years when things started to change. At first, it was so subtle I didn't even notice. The instruments I maintained began showing tiny irregularities, temperature readings that spiked for just a second, electromagnetic sensors picking up brief pulses that shouldn't have been there. I'd check the equipment, run diagnostics, recalibrate everything. The readings would return to normal, and I'd file a maintenance report and forget about it. But the irregularities kept happening, always small, always brief, always just outside the range of what I could definitively call a malfunction. It was like the instruments were hiccuping, catching something for just a moment before losing it again. Then I started noticing the sounds. It began as a low hum, so quiet I thought it might be coming from the ventilation system. But when I checked the HVAC equipment, everything was running normally. The hum seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a frequency that lived just at the edge of hearing. Some days it was barely there. Other days it was strong enough that I'd find myself stopping in the middle of my work, tilting my head to listen. The hum had a strange quality to it. It wasn't constant, it would rise and fall in slow waves like breathing. And sometimes, late in the evening when I was finishing up my rounds, it would shift. The frequency would climb higher, becoming almost musical, before dropping back down to that barely perceptible drone. I mentioned it to my supervisor during one of our weekly check-ins. He nodded and made a note, said he'd have someone look at the building's electrical systems, but nothing came of it. The next week, when I brought it up again, he looked at me blankly for a moment before saying he didn't remember me mentioning any sounds. That should have been my first real warning, but I rationalized it. He was busy, distracted. Easy to forget a minor maintenance issue when you're managing a dozen different projects. The smell started around the same time, sweet and metallic like copper pennies dissolved in honey. It would appear without warning I'd be working at a terminal, focused on data entry, and suddenly the air would fill with that strange scent. It never lasted long, maybe 30 seconds at most, but it was always intense, overwhelming even. It made my stomach turn and my mouth water at the same time. I'd look around trying to find the source, but there was never anything obvious. No spilled chemicals, no overheating equipment, no food left behind by the day shift. The smell would just fade away as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined it. But the instruments didn't lie. During those moments when the smell was strongest, the electromagnetic sensors would go wild, brief, intense spikes that registered for just a few seconds before dropping back to baseline. I started keeping a log, noting every time it happened. The pattern was irregular but persistent, sometimes multiple times in a single day, sometimes not for a week or more. The lights began acting up next. The basement levels were illuminated by standard fluorescent fixtures, the kind that buzz quietly and flicker when they're getting old. But these weren't old, and the flickering I started noticing wasn't normal. Instead of the random stuttering of a dying bulb, the lights would pulse in slow, rhythmic waves. Dim, bright, like a heartbeat made of light. It was hypnotic. I'd find myself standing in the corridor, watching the lights breathe, losing track of time. Minutes would pass, sometimes longer, before I'd snap back to awareness, feeling disoriented and slightly nauseous. I replaced the bulbs, I checked the electrical connections. I even had the building's electrician come down to look at the fixtures. He found nothing wrong, but while he was there, the lights behaved perfectly. Steady, constant, normal. He gave me a look that suggested I might be working too much, spending too many hours alone in the basement. Maybe he was right, maybe the isolation was getting to me. I started taking longer breaks, going outside more often, trying to get some perspective. But even in the daylight, surrounded by open sky and fresh air, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The feeling of being watched started gradually. At first, it was just an occasional prickle at the back of my neck, the kind of sensation everyone gets sometimes in empty rooms or dark corners. But it became more frequent, more intense. I'd be working at a computer terminal, completely absorbed in my task, when suddenly every instinct would scream that someone was standing behind me. I'd turn around to find the corridor empty, of course, but the feeling wouldn't fade. It would linger for hours, that crawling awareness of unseen eyes, until I'd find myself checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The mirrors in the bathroom started bothering me too, not because of what I saw in them, but because of what I didn't see. I'd catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow or shape that should have been reflected but wasn't. When I'd look directly, there would be nothing there, just my own tired face staring back. But sometimes, for just a moment, my reflection would seem delayed. I'd move my hand, and the mirror image would follow a split second later, like there was lag in the connection between reality and reflection. It was subtle, so brief I could almost convince myself I'd imagined it. Almost. The pressure started around this time too, a weight on my chest that would appear whenever I was near certain pieces of equipment. The main computer terminal was the worst. Sitting in front of it felt like someone was pressing down on my lungs, making each breath a conscious effort. I'd find myself gasping, loosening my collar, trying to create space for air that seemed increasingly thin. My supervisor noticed I was spending less time at the terminal, relying more on the handheld devices for routine checks. When he asked about it, I told him I was trying to be more efficient, covering more ground during my shifts. It wasn't entirely a lie. I was avoiding that terminal, but I couldn't explain why without sounding paranoid or unstable. The dreams started bleeding into my waking hours. I'd be calibrating an instrument or entering data, and suddenly I'd remember that soft, breathing ground from my nighttime visions. The memory would be so vivid, so immediate, that for a moment I'd forget where I was. My hands would feel sluggish, my breathing would sink to that alien rhythm, and the basement corridor would seem to pulse with that sourceless light. These episodes never lasted long, but they left me shaken. The boundary between sleeping and waking was becoming thin, permeable. Things that belonged to dreams were seeping into reality, and reality was taking on the fluid, uncertain quality of dreams. I started avoiding the deepest parts of the basement, the storage areas and utility rooms where I rarely needed to go anyway. Something about those spaces felt different now, charged with potential. The air was thicker there, harder to breathe. The shadows seemed to move independently of their sources, and always that sense of being observed by something that had no business existing. But I couldn't avoid everything. My job required me to check certain instruments, to maintain specific equipment, and it was during one of these routine tasks that everything changed. I was in the main monitoring room, downloading data from the atmospheric sensors when the hum suddenly intensified, not gradually like it usually did, but all at once. The sound filled the room, filled my head until it was less something I heard than something I felt. My bones vibrated with it, my teeth ached. The lights began their pulsing rhythm, but faster now, more urgent. The sweet metallic smell flooded the air, so strong it made my eyes water, and the pressure on my chest became crushing, like I was being pressed between invisible plates. I tried to move to get away from the terminal, but my body wouldn't respond properly. Everything felt thick, dreamlike. My limbs moved through air that had become viscous, resistant. The room around me began to shift, walls breathing in that familiar rhythm, floor becoming soft and yielding beneath my feet. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time, not in a mirror, not in my peripheral vision, but directly in front of me. A shape that wasn't quite a shadow, wasn't quite light. It had no definite form, but I could sense its attention focused on me with laser intensity. It was studying me, learning me, changing me just by looking. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The thing I can't think of another word for it moved closer. Not walking, not floating, but shifting through space like reality was rearranging itself around it. And as it approached, I felt something fundamental about myself begin to alter. The change wasn't physical, at least not entirely. It was deeper than that, like it was rewriting the basic code of what I was, introducing new variables into the equation of my existence. I could feel myself becoming something other, something that would never quite fit back into the world I'd known. The next thing I remember clearly, I was outside the building, sitting in my car in the parking lot. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't get the key into the ignition. I had no memory of leaving the basement, no recollection of walking through the building or exiting through the main doors. I sat there until full darkness fell, trying to make sense of what had happened. Part of me wanted to go back inside to check the instruments, to find some rational explanation for what I'd experienced. but a deeper, more primal part of me knew that going back would be a mistake. Whatever was in that building, whatever I'd encountered in the monitoring room, it wasn't finished with me yet. I drove home that night and called in sick the next morning. Then the next. By the end of the week, I'd submitted my resignation. I told my supervisor I'd found another job, better pay, closer to family. He seemed surprised but didn't ask many questions. Maybe he was relieved. Maybe he'd noticed the changes in me, the way I'd been avoiding certain areas, certain tasks. I packed up my apartment and moved across the country within a month. New city, new job, new life. I told myself I was making a fresh start, leaving the strangeness behind. But you can't run from something that's already inside you. The dreams never stopped. If anything, they became more vivid, more detailed. I'd find myself back in that place with the breathing ground and sourceless light, but now I understood it wasn't just a dream. It was a memory of somewhere I'd been taken or had somehow traveled to during that final encounter. In the dreams, I could move more freely, explore more of that impossible space. I saw corridors that stretched beyond the horizon, rooms filled with equipment I didn't recognize, windows that looked out onto landscapes that hurt to perceive. And always that presence watching me, guiding me, showing me things I wasn't ready to understand. I'd wake from these dreams with knowledge I shouldn't have, understanding of concepts that had no names in any language I knew. My mind had been expanded, but not in a way that felt like growth. It felt like invasion, like something foreign had been installed in my consciousness and was slowly integrating itself with my thoughts. The physical changes were subtle but persistent. My reflection still lagged sometimes, just for a fraction of a second. Electronic devices would malfunction in my presence, not dramatically, just small glitches, brief failures that would resolve themselves as soon as I moved away. And that pressure on my chest never fully went away. It was always there, a reminder of what I'd encountered, what I'd become. I tried to live normally. I got a job at a small office, nothing involving research or scientific equipment. I made friends, went on dates, tried to convince myself I was healing. But the normalcy felt like a costume I was wearing, a performance I was giving for an audience that couldn't see the truth. Because the truth was, I wasn't alone anymore. That presence I'd encountered in the basement had followed me, or maybe it had never been separate from me to begin with. Maybe that final encounter hadn't been a meeting but a merging, a completion of a process that had been happening all along. I could feel it sometimes, lurking just beneath the surface of my consciousness. During quiet moments when my guard was down, I'd sense its attention turning inward, examining my thoughts, my memories, my dreams. It was patient, careful, learning how to exist within the framework of my mind without completely destroying what I'd been before. The worst part was the growing realization that this had all been planned. The job at the research facility, the gradual escalation of strange events, my final encounter with that impossible entity, none of it had been random. I'd been selected, prepared, slowly conditioned for something I still didn't fully understand. And I wasn't the only one. Sometimes, walking through crowds or sitting in restaurants, I'd catch a glimpse of someone else who carried the same invisible weight, the same haunted awareness in their eyes. We'd recognize each other for just a moment before looking away, neither of us willing to acknowledge what we'd seen. There are more of us than you might think. People who have had encounters they can't explain, experiences that change them in ways they can't describe. We live normal lives, hold normal jobs, maintain normal relationships. But underneath it all, we carry something that doesn't belong to this world, something that's slowly, patiently working toward a purpose we can only guess at. I'm telling you this now because I can feel it stirring again, that presence inside me becoming more active. The dreams are changing, showing me new places, new possibilities. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I can hear that familiar hum starting up again, rising from somewhere deep beneath the building's foundation. It's not over. Whatever happened to me in that basement, whatever process began during my time at the research facility, it's still continuing. I thought distance would protect me, that moving away would break whatever connection had been established. But you can't run from something that lives inside your own mind. The ground beneath my feet feels different now, softer somehow, like it's beginning to breathe. The lights in my apartment have started their slow, rhythmic pulsing, and that sweet metallic smell has returned, stronger than ever, filling the air around me as I speak these words into this recorder. I can feel it watching me now, that patient presence that's been my constant companion for all these years. It's pleased that I'm finally telling the truth, finally acknowledging what I've become. And I think it's almost ready to show me what comes next. The walls are starting to sigh in agreement. Story 7. I stood frozen by the window, my breath held as I stared at the unmoving curtain. It hung too quietly, as if waiting for a cue I couldn't hear. The room was still, silence pressing in, but the faint pulsation from the walls suggested I wasn't alone. The air felt dense, with layers of sound just beyond hearing, whispering warnings I couldn't comprehend. I fixated on the floor where the light pooled, certain it was changing, but never catching it in the act. Then, almost imperceptibly, the curtain swayed just once and settled back into stillness, nudging the air into a troubled calm. Nothing happened that night. I need to be clear about that from the start. There was nothing unusual, nothing worth remembering, certainly nothing worth talking about. I was just tired, probably overtired, and my mind was playing tricks on me. That's all it was, just an overactive imagination combined with exhaustion. I didn't see anything when I walked to the kitchen. The hallway was perfectly normal, just like it always is. Maybe the shadows seemed a little deeper than usual, but that was probably because I hadn't replaced the bulb in the overhead fixture. The one that had been flickering for weeks but never quite burned out. It cast this strange pattern on the walls, but patterns are just patterns. Light behaves predictably when it hits objects. There's nothing mysterious about it. The sound I heard wasn't really a sound at all. It was probably just the house settling, or maybe the refrigerator cycling on. Old appliances make all sorts of noises. That low humming that seemed to come from everywhere at once, that rhythmic pulse that felt like it was syncing with my heartbeat, that was just mechanical noise. Houses are full of mechanical noise. I've lived here long enough to know every creak and groan. I definitely didn't open the basement door. I had no reason to go down there, especially not at that hour. The door was closed when I went to bed, and it was closed when I woke up. If I remember the basement stairs looking different somehow, if I recall them seeming to descend much further than they should, well, that's just because I was half asleep. Memory gets fuzzy when you're not fully conscious. The fact that I can picture exactly how the concrete walls looked, how they seemed to curve away into darkness that felt almost solid, that's just my brain filling in details that weren't really there. The temperature in the house was normal. Maybe I felt a little cold, but the heating system has always been inconsistent. The way the air seemed to move on its own, creating these gentle currents that brushed against my skin like fingers, that was just the HVAC system doing what HVAC systems do. The metallic taste in my mouth was probably from the tap water. The pipes are old. Old pipes can affect the taste of water. I wasn't outside. I know I wasn't outside because I would remember putting on shoes, unlocking the door, stepping onto the porch. I would remember the feeling of grass under my feet, the way the ground seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, like something massive was breathing beneath the surface. I would remember how the street looked empty, but not really empty, how the darkness between the streetlights seemed deeper than it should be, almost three-dimensional. But I don't remember any of that because it didn't happen. The sky was perfectly normal that night, just regular darkness, maybe some clouds. I didn't look up and see anything unusual. I didn't see lights that moved too smoothly, too purposefully, in patterns that made no sense for aircraft or satellites. The way they seemed to respond to my attention, growing brighter when I focused on them and dimming when I tried to look away, that was just my eyes adjusting to the darkness. Eyes do that. It's basic biology. I went back inside because that's where I belonged, not because I felt watched, not because the air outside had that electric quality that made my skin tingle and my hair stand on end, not because I heard that sound again, that humming that seemed to be coming from the sky itself. I went inside because it was late and I was tired, and rational people go inside when they're tired. The living room was exactly as I'd left it. The furniture hadn't moved. The couch was still against the far wall, the coffee table still centered on the rug. If the room felt different somehow, if the proportions seemed slightly off, if the ceiling appeared higher than it should be, well, lighting can play tricks on perception. Shadows can make familiar spaces seem foreign. There's nothing supernatural about that. I sat down in my usual chair, the one by the window. The fabric felt different under my hands, smoother somehow, almost warm to the touch despite the coolness of the room. But fabric changes with temperature and humidity. The way it seemed to pulse gently, like it was alive, like it was breathing in sync with something I couldn't see, that was just my imagination. Tired minds create patterns where none exist. The curtains were still, I want to emphasize that. They hung perfectly still, no movement at all. The fact that I kept watching them, waiting for something that never came, that's just because I was on edge. Overtired people often feel anxious for no reason. The way the fabric seemed to shimmer occasionally, catching light that wasn't there, that was probably just a trick of my peripheral vision. Peripheral vision is notoriously unreliable. I didn't fall asleep in the chair. I was fully conscious the entire time. If I lost some hours, if the darkness outside seemed to shift and change in ways that had nothing to do with the normal progression of night toward dawn, that was just because I was more tired than I realized. Time perception gets distorted when you're exhausted. The feeling that something was happening around me while I sat there, something important and terrible and beautiful all at once, that was just my mind trying to make sense of fatigue. When I finally went to bed, everything was normal. The hallway looked exactly like it always does. The walls were the same color they've always been, not that strange shade of blue-gray that seemed to shift depending on how I looked at it. The floor didn't feel different under my feet, didn't have that slight give to it, as if it were made of something softer than wood. The air didn't taste different, didn't carry that metallic sweetness that made me think of copper pennies and electrical storms. My bedroom was unchanged. The bed was where it's always been, the dresser against the same wall, the closet door closed just like I always leave it. If the room felt larger somehow, if the shadows in the corners seemed deeper and more substantial, if I had the distinct impression that I wasn't alone even though I knew I was well, bedrooms can feel different at night. It's a psychological thing. Fear of the dark is primal and irrational. I lay down and closed my eyes. I didn't hear anything unusual. No sounds from outside, no movement in the house, certainly nothing that seemed to be coming from inside the walls themselves. That rhythmic tapping, like Morse code, but in a language I didn't recognize, that was probably just my heart beating. When you're lying still in a quiet room, you become aware of your own body sounds. It's perfectly natural. The dreams I had weren't really dreams at all. They were just random neural firing, the brain's way of processing the day's experiences. The fact that they felt more real than reality, more vivid than any dream I'd ever had, that's not unusual. Stress can intensify dream experiences. The images that played behind my closed eyelids, vast spaces filled with light that wasn't quite light, figures that moved with purpose but without form, sounds that conveyed meaning without words. Those were just my subconscious mind sorting through impressions and memories. I woke up in my own bed, in my own room, in my own house. Everything was exactly as it should be. The fact that my sheets were damp with sweat despite the coolness of the room, that my muscles ached as if I'd been walking for hours, that my mouth still carried that metallic taste, those were just physical responses to vivid dreams. The body sometimes reacts to imagined experiences as if they were real. It's well documented. The morning was perfectly ordinary. Sunlight came through the windows at the usual angle, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air currents. Normal dust motes behaving according to normal physics. Not like the particles I thought I remembered from the night before, the ones that seemed to move with intention, forming patterns that almost looked like symbols before dissolving back into randomness. I made coffee and toast just like every morning. The routine was comforting, familiar. If the coffee tasted different, if it carried that same metallic undertone I'd noticed the night before, that was probably because I needed to clean the coffee maker. If the toast seemed to have a texture I couldn't quite identify, if eating it felt like consuming something that wasn't quite food, well, bread can go stale quickly in humid weather. Looking back now, I can say with complete certainty that nothing unusual happened. Nothing worth worrying about, nothing worth investigating, nothing worth remembering in detail. My mind was playing tricks on me, creating false memories, false impressions, false fears. It was all perfectly explainable, perfectly normal, perfectly forgettable. The fact that I keep thinking about it doesn't mean anything. Everyone has nights when their imagination runs wild. Everyone has experiences that feel significant even when they're not. The human brain is designed to find patterns and meaning even in random events. It's a survival mechanism that sometimes misfires in our safe, modern world. I'm not avoiding the basement, I just don't have any reason to go down there. The fact that every time I walk past the door I feel that same electric tingle on my skin, that same sense of something vast and patient waiting in the darkness below, that's just anxiety. Basements are naturally unsettling spaces, dark, underground, removed from the normal flow of household life. It's natural to feel uncomfortable about them. The house has been quiet since then. No unusual sounds, no strange temperature fluctuations, no sense of being observed or evaluated. Everything has returned to normal, assuming it was ever abnormal to begin with, which it wasn't. I sleep through the night now without any unusual dreams. I wake up refreshed and rational, ready to face another ordinary day in my ordinary life. If I sometimes catch myself staring at the curtains, waiting for movement that doesn't come, that's just a residual effect of that one confusing night. If I sometimes feel compelled to check the basement door, to make sure it's still closed, still locked, still keeping whatever isn't down there safely contained well, checking locks is a normal security behavior. Responsible homeowners verify that their houses are secure. The important thing is that I understand what happened, or rather, what didn't happen. My mind created an experience that felt real but wasn't. It's actually quite common. Stress, fatigue, and isolation can combine to produce very convincing hallucinations. The brain is remarkably good at creating false memories, false sensations, false fears. Understanding this makes the whole experience less troubling, less significant. I've told myself this story so many times now that I almost believe it. The rational explanation, the logical sequence of cause and effect, the reassuring conclusion that nothing important occurred. It's a good story, a comforting story, a story that lets me sleep at night and go about my daily routine without fear or confusion. But sometimes, usually right before dawn, I find myself standing by the window again. The curtains hang perfectly still, just like they always do. The room is quiet, the house is quiet, the world outside is quiet. Everything is exactly as it should be. Normal, safe, predictable. And yet, as I stand there in the growing light, I can't shake the feeling that it's all about to start again. Story 8. I'm trying to piece it back together. The fragments come and go like static on an old radio, clear for a moment before dissolving into white noise. That click of glass meeting glass, it keeps returning, echoing through everything else I think I remember. But I'm getting ahead of myself, aren't I? The books were heavy. That much feels real. My arms ached from carrying them, though I can't recall what they were or why I needed them. The room, yes, the room comes back sometimes. Walls that seem to breathe, expanding and contracting with each heartbeat I could hear in my ears. The air was wrong there, thick like trying to breathe through wet fabric. And that scent metallic, sharp, with an undertone of something organic and warm. It made my stomach turn, but I couldn't leave. Or maybe I couldn't remember how I'd gotten there in the first place. There was a hum, always a hum. It lived inside my skull, vibrating against the bone until my teeth ached. Sometimes it would pulse, syncing with something I couldn't see but could feel pressing against the back of my eyes. The sound wasn't coming from anywhere in the room. It was coming from me or through me, or maybe I was just imagining it. But imagined things don't make your molars throb, do they? I remember touching the wall once. The surface was smooth, too smooth, like polished stone that had been warmed by body heat. My palm left a print there, and when I pulled my hand away, the mark remained longer than it should have, much longer. The wall seemed to absorb the warmth, drinking it in with an almost grateful hunger. That can't be right, though. Walls don't hunger. The books scattered when I dropped them. That sound, dozens of pages fluttering like dying birds, it cut through the hum for just a moment. In that silence, I heard something else. Breathing that wasn't mine. Slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. But when I turned, there was only the wall with my handprint still glowing faintly against its surface. Light leaked under a door I hadn't noticed before. Not electric light, something warmer, more organic. It pulsed with the same rhythm as the hum in my head, and I found myself walking toward it without deciding to move. Each step felt like pushing through invisible water, the air growing thicker with every inch. The floorboards didn't creak. They gave slightly under my weight, like they were made of something softer than wood. There was a figure once, I think, standing perfectly still in the corner where the light couldn't reach. It might have been a coat hanging on a hook or shadows playing tricks, but it had the shape of someone waiting. Someone who had been waiting for a very long time. I think I called out, but the sound died in my throat before it could form words. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, but I felt its attention like heat from a fire. My skin remembers things my mind won't hold on to. The sensation of fingers brushing my arm, so light they might have been imagined, except they left trails of cold that lasted for what felt like hours. Something touched my shoulder once, a pressure that was there and gone so quickly I spun around to find nothing but empty air. But the weight of that touch lingered, like a hand that had never lifted. The smell got stronger near the door. Metal and warmth and something else, something that reminded me of copper pennies held too long in a sweating palm. It made my mouth water and my stomach clench at the same time. I pressed my face close to the gap under the door, trying to see the source of that pulsing light, but the brightness made my eyes water until everything blurred. I think I opened the door. The memory is slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. There was a moment of resistance, as if something on the other side was pushing back, and then it gave way so suddenly I stumbled forward. The light washed over me, not warm like I'd expected, but cold, so cold it burned. And in that burning brightness I saw. But that's where it breaks apart again. The memory fractures like glass, leaving only the sensation of falling upward, of my feet leaving the ground while gravity pulled in the wrong direction. The hum became a roar, filling every space inside me until I was nothing but sound and vibration and the taste of copper on my tongue. I woke up somewhere else, or maybe I never woke up at all. Maybe I'm still in that room, still standing before that door with the light bleeding underneath. The books are still scattered at my feet in some version of this story, pages ruffling in a wind that doesn't exist. My handprint still glows on the wall that breathes. Sometimes I catch myself listening for that click of glass meeting glass. It happens at the strangest moments while I'm washing dishes, or walking down empty hallways, or lying in bed staring at the ceiling. The sound that started everything, or maybe ended it. I can't tell the difference anymore. There are gaps in my memory like missing teeth, spaces where something important should be but isn't. I run my tongue over them compulsively, probing the empty spaces, hoping to find some trace of what was lost. But there's only the smooth, aching absence where knowledge used to live. The figure in the corner visits my dreams now, still motionless, still waiting, but closer each time. I can almost make out its face in the shadows, almost understand what it's been trying to tell me with its perfect stillness. Almost, but not quite. The details slip away the moment I try to focus on them, leaving only the impression of something patient and hungry and infinitely sad. My reflection looks wrong in mirrors sometimes, not dramatically, just slightly off, like a photograph taken a fraction of a second too late. My eyes hold shadows they shouldn't, and my smile never quite reaches the corners where it used to. I touch the glass and my reflection touches back, but there's a delay, a hesitation, as if it's checking with someone else before copying my movements. The hum never really stopped. It's quieter now, so faint I sometimes think it's just the sound of my own blood moving through my veins. But then it pulses just once, and I know it's still there. Still connected to whatever happened in that room with the breathing walls and the door full of cold light. Still waiting for me to remember the rest. I've been writing this down, trying to capture the fragments before they slip away entirely, but the words feel inadequate, like trying to describe color to someone who's never seen. The experience exists in some space between memory and sensation, too visceral for language, too strange for linear narrative. It lives in the spaces between thoughts, in the pause between heartbeats. There was music once, I think, not heard but felt, vibrations that traveled up through the floor and into my bones, a rhythm that matched the pulsing light that synced with the breathing of the walls. I found myself swaying to it, my body responding to frequencies my ears couldn't detect. The music was beautiful and terrible, like the sound of stars dying in perfect harmony. The scent of metal stays with me. It clings to my clothes, my hair, my skin, no matter how many times I wash. Others don't seem to notice it, but I catch whiffs at random moments, sharp and clean and wrong. It's strongest when I'm trying to sleep, when my guard is down and the memories creep closer to the surface. I think something followed me out of that room, not the figure that stayed behind, still waiting in its corner. Something else, something that rides in the spaces between my thoughts and whispers in frequencies just below hearing. It doesn't mean me harm, I don't think. It's just curious, studying me the way I might study an insect under glass. The click of glass meeting glass happened again yesterday. I was alone in my kitchen, no glasses anywhere near each other, but I heard it clear as a bell. For just a moment, the walls seemed to lean inward and the air grew thick with that familiar metallic scent. The hum in my skull pulsed once, twice, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm. I think I'm remembering more than I'm forgetting now. The fragments are connecting, forming patterns I'm not sure I want to understand. That door's still there, somewhere behind my eyes, still leaking its cold light into spaces that shouldn't exist. and I'm still standing before it, my hand reaching for a knob that burns like ice. The books I dropped, I think they were journals, my journals, pages filled with handwriting I recognized but couldn't read, documenting experiences I'd lived but couldn't remember. Each page a fragment, each word a piece of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve for longer than I knew. Something is waking up, in the space behind my thoughts, in the pause between breaths, something that has been sleeping is beginning to stir. The memories are getting stronger, more insistent, pushing against the barriers I built to keep them out. Soon, I think, I won't have a choice about remembering. The hum is getting louder, Story 9. The door swung open with a whisper, no satisfying pushback, just a gliding compliance that felt wrong. Stepping inside, my shoes met the carpet, but no muffled thud comforted my ears. Even the air felt lighter, missing its usual density. The hallway seemed longer this evening, stretching unnaturally with walls that absorbed the shuffle of my steps. I crossed to the mirror where my reflection should have been a familiar anchor, yet the surface remained blank, defiant in its refusal to acknowledge me. Something about the glass shimmered with a presence that wasn't. But nothing really happened that night. I need to make that clear from the start. Whatever you think you're going to hear, whatever details might slip out as I tell this, none of it was real. It was just fatigue, maybe some stress from work, the kind of thing that makes your mind play tricks on you. I've been sleeping better lately, eating regular meals, taking my vitamins. Everything's perfectly normal now. The mirror thing, for instance, mirrors don't just stop reflecting people. That's not how physics works. I must have been looking at it from the wrong angle, or maybe there was a film of dust on the surface that caught the light strangely. Houses settle, especially older ones like mine. The hallway probably looked different because of shadows or because I was distracted, thinking about something else entirely. These things have rational explanations. I didn't see anything unusual in that hallway, not the way the walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. Not the way the floorboards beneath the carpet felt soft, almost spongy, like walking on something alive. And I definitely didn't notice how the air tasted metallic, sharp against my tongue in a way that made my teeth ache. Those are just the kinds of details your brain invents when you're overtired, when you've been working too many late nights in a row. The temperature in the house was normal, room temperature, maybe 72 degrees, the way I always keep it. It wasn't cold enough to make me shiver, and it certainly wasn't warm enough to make me sweat the way I did. The dampness on my shirt was probably just from the humidity outside. It had been raining earlier, I think, though I can't quite remember hearing the drops on the roof or seeing them streak the windows, but there must have been rain. That would explain the smell, that metallic scent that seemed to cling to everything, seeping through the walls themselves. I went to bed at my usual time. Nothing kept me awake, no sounds from other parts of the house, no creaking or settling that seemed too deliberate, too rhythmic to be random. I didn't lie there listening to what sounded like footsteps in rooms I knew were empty, measured and patient, as if someone was pacing back and forth, waiting for something. The house was quiet, completely quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware of your own pulse, your own breathing, the small wet sounds your mouth makes when you swallow. When I finally did fall asleep, I slept soundly. No dreams, certainly no nightmares. I didn't find myself standing in that long hallway again, watching the walls curve inward like the inside of a throat. I didn't see the mirror reflecting something that wasn't me, something tall and still that watched from behind my shoulder. And I definitely didn't hear that voice, calm and familiar, speaking words I couldn't quite understand but somehow knew were meant for me. The voice wasn't real anyway. It was probably just the heating system, or maybe sounds from outside filtering through the walls. Voices carry strangely at night, especially when the air is thick and damp. What sounded like my name being called over and over, patient and insistent, was most likely just the wind, or maybe a neighbor's television turned up too loud. The fact that it seemed to come from inside my own head, that it felt like someone speaking directly into my ear while I lay there with my eyes squeezed shut, doesn't mean anything. That's just how sound works sometimes. I stayed in bed the whole night. I didn't get up and walk through the house, following that voice as it led me from room to room, showing me things I'd never noticed before. The way the walls in the kitchen bulged outward in places, as if something large was pressed against them from the other side. The way the refrigerator hummed a tune that almost sounded like a lullaby, sweet and hypnotic. The way the basement door stood slightly ajar, though I always keep it locked, with something pale visible in the gap, something that might have been fingers curled around the edge. I don't even remember opening that door. I certainly didn't walk down those stairs, each step taking me deeper into darkness that felt warm and welcoming rather than frightening. The basement was normal, just concrete walls and a water heater, maybe some old boxes I'd been meaning to sort through. It wasn't larger than it should have been, stretching back into shadows that seemed to move and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. And there wasn't anything else down there with me, nothing that breathed in rhythm with my own breathing, nothing that made the air stir against my skin like invisible hands. The light switch worked perfectly fine. I didn't have to feel around in the dark, my fingers brushing against something smooth and warm that definitely wasn't the wall. The bulb came on immediately, casting normal shadows in normal places. It didn't flicker or dim, and it certainly didn't reveal things that shouldn't have been there. The corner where I thought I saw movement was empty, just pipes and dust, and the normal debris that accumulates in basements over time. I went back upstairs after a few minutes. There was no reason to stay down there, no sense of something calling to me from the deeper shadows, no feeling that I was supposed to wait for something to happen. The stairs creaked normally under my weight, and the door closed behind me with a satisfying click. I locked it again, turned the deadbolt until it was secure, though I couldn't shake the feeling that locks don't really matter when whatever wants to get through can simply make you open them yourself. But that's just paranoia talking. Stress and fatigue can make you think all sorts of strange things. They can make you believe you remember conversations you never had, places you never went, sensations you never felt. The mind is remarkably good at creating false memories, especially when you're not sleeping well or eating properly. Everything I thought I experienced that night can be explained by simple psychology and physiology. The marks on my arms, for instance, those small indentations that looked almost like fingerprints, arranged in a pattern that suggested someone had gripped me tightly. Those were probably just from sleeping awkwardly, pressing against the sheets or the mattress in a way that left temporary impressions on my skin. They faded by morning anyway, so they couldn't have been very significant. And the fact that they were exactly the right size and spacing for human fingers, but just a little too long, a little too narrow, doesn't mean anything at all. I showered and got dressed like always. The water ran clear and hot, not rust-colored the way I thought I remembered, and it didn't taste metallic when it accidentally got in my mouth, sharp and almost electric on my tongue. The bathroom mirror showed my reflection perfectly normally, no distortions or empty spaces, no sense of something standing just behind me where I couldn't see it clearly. When I brushed my teeth, I didn't notice that my gums were bleeding, or that the blood in the sink formed patterns that looked almost like symbols, almost like writing in a language I'd never seen but somehow understood. Work was normal that day. Nobody commented on how tired I looked or asked if I was feeling all right. My colleagues didn't seem to avoid making eye contact with me, and they certainly didn't look concerned when I mentioned having trouble sleeping. The conversation flowed normally about weather and weekend plans and the usual office gossip. Nobody suggested I should see a doctor or take some time off, or asked why I kept checking over my shoulder as if expecting someone to be there. The day passed quickly and quietly. I got my work done, answered emails, attended meetings where everyone spoke in normal voices about normal things. Nobody whispered and nobody spoke in that same calm, patient tone I'd been hearing in my head all morning. When my phone rang, it was always someone I recognized, always about something routine and predictable. The static I thought I heard underneath their voices was just a bad connection, nothing more. Evening came normally, the way it always does. The sun set at the appropriate time, painting the sky in ordinary colors. I drove home through familiar streets, past houses where normal people were doing normal things behind lit windows. My own house looked exactly as I'd left it, with no signs that anything had changed or been disturbed. The front door was locked, the windows were secure, and everything inside was exactly where it belonged. I made dinner something simple, though I found I wasn't very hungry. Food tasted strange, too sharp or too bland, as if my sense of taste had been altered somehow. But that's normal when you're stressed or not sleeping well. Your body's chemistry changes, affects how you perceive flavors and textures. The fact that everything tasted vaguely metallic, with an underlying sweetness that reminded me of medicine, was just a temporary side effect of fatigue. The evening news played in the background while I ate, familiar voices reporting on familiar types of stories. Traffic accidents, weather patterns, local politics, nothing unusual, nothing that should have made me feel uneasy. I didn't pay close attention to what they were saying, but the sound of their voices was comforting, a normal human presence in the quiet house. When the signal occasionally dissolved into static, or when I thought I heard other voices speaking underneath the reporter's words, I knew it was just interference from the weather or maybe a problem with the cable connection. I went to bed early, hoping for better sleep. The bedroom was comfortable and familiar, with my own sheets and pillows, my own clothes folded neatly in drawers that opened and closed normally. The windows were secure, the curtains drawn against the darkness outside. Nothing moved in the shadows, and nothing watched from the corners where the walls met the ceiling. The house settled around me with ordinary sounds, creaks and sighs that meant nothing more than wood and metal expanding and contracting with changes in temperature. Sleep came easily this time. No lying awake listening to sounds that weren't there, no sense of presence in the room with me. I didn't dream about walking through rooms that were larger than they should be, or about voices calling my name from places I couldn't locate. And I certainly didn't dream about understanding, finally, what was being asked of me, what I was supposed to do next. Dreams like that would be disturbing, the kind of thing that might make someone question their own sanity. So it's fortunate they never happened. I woke up refreshed and clear-headed, ready for another normal day. The morning light came through the windows at the right angle, casting familiar shadows in familiar places. My reflection looked back at me from the bathroom mirror, tired but recognizable, with no strange distortions or empty spaces where my face should have been. Everything was exactly as it should be, exactly as it always had been. But tonight, as I prepare for bed again, I find myself thinking about that voice, the one that wasn't real, how patient it sounded, how certain, how it seemed to know things about me that I'd never told anyone, things I'd never even admitted to myself. And I can't help wondering what might happen if I stopped fighting it, stopped insisting that none of this was real. What might happen if I just listened, really listened, and did what it's been asking me to do all along. Not that I'm going to find out, because nothing happened, nothing is happening, and nothing ever will. Everything is perfectly normal, and tomorrow will be just another ordinary day. The voice will stay quiet, the mirrors will show only what they're supposed to show, and the basement door will remain locked tight. There's absolutely no reason to think otherwise, no reason to expect anything different. But just in case, I think I'll leave the lights on tonight. Story 10. I stood motionless, eyes fixed on the front door where the doormat lay unnaturally flat. The wind danced lightly around the porch, yet not a corner of it fluttered. My breath seemed loud in the muffled stillness, and the distant rustle of leaves served only to deepen the quiet. The porch steps creaked unprompted, hinting at a presence unseen. I was waiting for some sign, some alteration in this oppressive lull. Then I caught it, the fine layer of dust where a note should have been. It had always been there before. There's this sound that keeps coming back to me, a low-frequency hum like electricity running through copper pipes buried in walls. It starts behind my left ear and spreads until my whole skull vibrates with it. Sometimes I smell burnt ozone afterward, that sharp metallic taste that coats your tongue during thunderstorms. But there's never any storm, just that persistent buzz that makes my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. I can't place when I first heard it. Was I in the kitchen? The basement, standing in that hallway with the flickering bulb overhead. The memory shifts every time I reach for it. I wasn't alone in my house that night. Or was it day? The light coming through the windows felt wrong, too bright and too dim at the same time, like looking at the world through frosted glass. Something moved in my peripheral vision, always just outside the frame of direct sight. When I turned my head, nothing. But the air held that peculiar weight of recent movement, molecules still disturbed by a passing form. My skin prickled with awareness. The floorboards behind me creaked in a rhythm that didn't match my breathing or heartbeat. 1, 2, pause, 1, 2, pause, like footsteps trying to sync with mine, but always slightly off tempo. I held my breath and the creaking stopped. When I exhaled, it resumed. My thoughts felt scrambled, like radio signals crossing and interfering with each other. I'd start thinking about making coffee and suddenly find myself wondering about the temperature of concrete at 3 in the morning. Words would form in my mind that I didn't recognize, syllables that felt foreign on my tongue yet familiar in some deep, unsettling way. I caught myself humming melodies I'd never heard before, complex harmonies that seemed to come from somewhere outside my own memory. My hands moved without conscious direction, tracing patterns in the air, geometric shapes that made perfect sense in the moment, but dissolved into nonsense when I tried to examine them. Was I awake? Was I dreaming? The boundary between the two had become impossibly thin. The lights came first, not the warm yellow of house lamps or the harsh white of fluorescence, but something in between, something that pulsed with organic rhythm. They appeared in the corners of rooms, casting shadows that bent the wrong way, creating angles where none should exist. Then the absence of sound, so complete it felt like pressure in my ears. Even my heartbeat became muted, distant, as if heard through water. Objects on tables trembled without cause, small vibrations that sent ripples through glasses of water and made picture frames tap against walls. The air tasted of copper pennies and something else, something I couldn't name but recognized nonetheless. Through it all, that feeling of being observed, measured, cataloged by intelligence that operated on frequencies I couldn't comprehend. Now there are moments when I catch myself staring at my hands, surprised by their familiarity. The lines on my palms seem deeper, more pronounced, as if they've been retraced by invisible fingers. My reflection in mirrors takes a split second longer to move when I move, creating brief moments of disconnection that make my stomach lurch. Food tastes different, not bad exactly, but processed through senses that have been subtly recalibrated. I find myself drawn to certain frequencies on the radio, static-filled stations that broadcast nothing but white noise, yet I listen with rapt attention as if decoding messages in the interference. Sleep comes in fragments now, brief periods of unconsciousness punctuated by awareness of lying motionless while something examines the contents of my dreams. But that's not how it happened, is it? The lights were different, softer, more like moonlight filtered through fog. And there was sound, definitely sound, a low harmonic tone that made the windows vibrate in their frames. I wasn't standing in the hallway but sitting in the living room chair, the one that faces away from the window. My body felt heavy, weighted down as if gravity had intensified around me specifically. The air shimmered with heat distortion despite the coolness of the room. Shadows moved independently of their sources, sliding across walls like liquid darkness. I tried to speak, but my voice came out as whispers, words that dissipated before they could form meaning. The sensation of being lifted, not physically but mentally, consciousness separated from flesh and suspended in space that existed between seconds. Something fundamental has shifted in the architecture of my perception. I no longer trust the stability of walls or the reliability of floors beneath my feet. Time moves in stutters and loops, minutes that stretch into hours, hours that compress into heartbeats. I've stopped trying to understand what happened in that space between the before and after. Understanding feels dangerous now, like staring directly into light that could burn away the protective barriers my mind has constructed. The dust on the doormat remains undisturbed, but I know now that some messages aren't meant to be read, only felt in the hollow spaces they leave behind. I wait, but I'm no longer sure what I'm waiting for, only that the waiting itself has become a form of remembering I can almost bear.